Hello everyone, my name is Louisette Lontang and I live in Waterloo, Ontario. I am a Mi'kmaq Métis environmental advocate for about 16 years and I understand policy of both Aboriginal law as well as provincial laws and how they work. I attended an Idle No More event that took place at the United Church in Kitchener, Ontario. And that's where I met a professional engineer who had visited Attawapiskat. And he said, in his view, the way they engineered this community is illegal. They created the sewage discharge upstream of where the water intake is. And that means that the effluent is getting into the water system. People are drinking chemicals that cannot be removed by normal filtration processes. Things like prescription medicine, antidepressants, even the lead in the piping of these antiquated systems can pose a human health risk in terms of mental development. These people are being exposed to endocrine disruption and all kinds of different risks as a result of these poorly planned communities. There was flooding that took place which flooded sewage underneath 3 buildings that housed 90 people. And there are chemical leaks as well that took place underneath the homes. So you have effluent and you have petrochemicals that are creating fumes that are affecting people's bodies and the way that their mental processes are like. This isn't reasonable. This is criminal, in my view. A lot of the housing was built with wood that was not mold resistant. And you're putting wooden buildings essentially in an area that floods. The entire community is practically built inside a floodplain. And there have been mass evacuations numerous times as a result of the placement of these dwellings. It isn't safe for human life to be treated like this. Mike Holmes, who is the famous home renovator, had actually done an audit of First Nations communities, and he was disgusted at the building materials used. And the reason why the Canadian government has gotten away with this for so long is because the building codes are provincial law, and it doesn't apply on a reserve because the reserves are under federal jurisdiction. And across Canada, we have issues about that because the Indian Act predated pollution issues for the most part. It didn't have regard for these kind of issues manifesting. We have, for example, if a chemical spill were to happen in my community, I have the power to call the Provincial Ministry of Natural Resources, and they would come, analyze the spill, and press charges. And if it happens again, then the spills increase in terms of fine. But in a reservation, they can't even get to the first fine because when they go to the province, they're told it's on a reservation, it's a federal issue. They go to the federal government and they're told, sorry, but pollution is a provincial issue. We can't help you. And as a result, we have throughout Canada a weakened law when it comes to the protection of First Nations reserves across Canada. And industry is very savvy, so they set up shop beside First Nations, knowing that the laws to protect the environment are weaker and that prosecution is less likely to occur as a result. So we're talking projects like uranium mines and nuclear projects. We're talking things like gold mines, which release mercury into water systems. That's another issue. In terms of mental illnesses and biochemical reactions, we are dealing with things like the tar sands. All these things are strategically built upstream and upwind to First Nations communities. We have areas like Amjwaneng in Sarnia, who have a concentrated amount of oil petrochemical plants in their area, surrounding them on all 4 sides. We're talking about 60 plants within a 25-kilometer radius. And these emissions have an effect. In Sarnia and Namjuanang, they've got the lowest birth ratio in the world as a result of this. And that's because the protections for clean air and water are not the same for First Nations communities as they are for other Canadians. Well, not that we're Canadian to begin with, but, technically speaking, we are within the same area. The laws differ, and that has to change. And the fundamental issue of why those laws are different dates way back to Papal Bull, which is a law issued by the Vatican. One of the main influencers of Canadian policy is called the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery was released 1 year after Columbus had discovered America. And this doctrine specifically states that if an explorer lands on a property and there are no Christians there, he has the right to all resources of that land, unless there are Christians already present, in which case there'd be a different protocol to follow. So this kind of law crafted the allowance for things such as the Crusades, slavery, the subjugation of indigenous people all across the world, not just in North America, but we're talking places like India and in the Middle East. And these policies are still shaping the way governance is taking place today. So we are dealing with an antiquated law which has no context with modern, internationally recognized legislation which exists. The UN gave Indigenous people rights, and this antiquated law does not apply with today's current logic, wisdom, or human rights. And so we need to revisit this, and that requires the Pope, the assistance of the Pope to help. It's even when we followed the doctrine to the T, when we became a Catholic nation, it didn't stop genocides from taking place. I'm Mi'kmaq Métis, and my ancestor, Henri Membertou, had signed a wampum agreement with the Vatican called the Vatican Concordat of 1610. This was approximately 250 years before the Constitution of Canada was crafted. And it didn't protect us from smallpox genocides. It didn't protect the Métis population of the Acadians from being deported. It didn't protect us. So it's not as though we didn't keep up our end of the deal. I am baptized and I'm Roman Catholic in spite of the fact the church tried to drive us away from the church. And the reason my family kept the faith is because we thought the Vatican had the interpretation of Christ wrong in the way that they allowed the subjugation of other people. We didn't believe that that was the philosophy of Christ at all. And secondly, it was important to maintain generation after generation contact with these laws by maintaining our side of it. So I am Catholic because A, our treaties are bound to remaining Catholic, and B, we shared in a philosophy of equity and respect and dignity for human life as Christ did, which we do not see reflected in the institution of the church. How we process our faith is based on the deeper sense of universal love that we believe Christ was trying to teach. And that's what brought us to the attraction of becoming Catholic to begin with. And it's not reasonable for us to continue the subjugation of any group of people any longer. We have a double standard in Canada in terms of the quality of life issues. I believe that if you're Indigenous in Canada, you're ranked at 67 out of quality of life, 67 or 69. And if you're, say, white Canadian or live in Canada as an identified community, then your standard of living is actually at the top 6%. So there's this vast chasm in terms of quality of life between a Canadian citizen and a First Nations community within Canada. And that chasm is based on a system of racism that has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. And we need to close that gap if we are to create true social equity and justice, and if we are to ratify the wampums as issued. There was the spirit of collaboration when the wampums were created. The essence of, we are two different cultures living within the same land, let us live harmoniously and share the resources. And that idea and philosophy is still very much a part of Indigenous life today, but it hasn't been honored by the Canadian government in terms of allowing our dialogue when it comes to resource extraction, when it comes to prior and informed consent on projects that affect our lives, our territory, our sacred spaces, our medicines, our communities. And that's not reasonable. At this point, with all these polluting factories setting up beside First Nations communities, it got so bad and so obvious an issue that the province of Nova Scotia has issued a bill. It's called Bill 111, that's 111, and it's to specifically stop environmental racism. Because in Nova Scotia, they noticed how the heaviest of the polluters were always located directly beside Acadian communities, who are the Métis, with the Mi'kmaq. It's beside Indigenous Mi'kmaq communities and beside Black communities in Nova Scotia. These people, these groups of people, are being subjugated to pollution from dumps, from fuel emissions, from all kinds of resource extraction projects, and they are suffering as a result with contaminated water, with unsafe air, with higher cancer rates, higher mortality, and the list goes on. So we can't keep this up. This violates international law. It violates common sense to have a two-tier system of protecting human life. We need to close that gap. And it takes not only the voice of Indigenous people to make it happen, it takes the voice of all people, all citizens on all sides of the issue. Right now, we're seeing a fusion between different movements. We have Black Lives Matter joining up with Idle No More, joining up with the plight of Palestinians and other people who've been repressed. Even Idle No More is influencing movements in Australia and in Texas and in Mexico and in South America. Indigenous people are waking up to the fact that we have had this double standard and we can no longer survive if this continues. We are losing our planet now. And part of the reason why it got so bad was because the people in charge lost their moral compass. When Wall Street right now is investing money, there is a small group of people. We're talking small, big industries who govern pretty much everything that's happening nowadays. That crosses into the concepts of Illuminati, if you will. These are big companies. Microsoft, Apple, Pfizer, Vanguard, BlackRock, all of these investment agencies linked to things like SNC-Lavalin. SNC-Lavalin has 115 companies and affiliates who are blacklisted on the World Bank list right now. And they are the #1 corrupt company in Canada right now. And because of their outrageous corruption, we are now listed as the #1 most corrupt nation on the list of the World Bank blacklisted companies. And this is Canada. Okay, now how these guys make their money is shady. And the Panama Papers is important because that's tapping into the fact that a lot of the multinationals who are making the decisions about our lives, the fate of our lives, have not been paying their taxes. They're not respecting Canadian culture or Canadian taxpayers anymore. They haven't respected Indigenous people. And that apathy and that greed for wealth is killing us at this point. In our planet, it's destroying our environment. We have now reached the point where there are wars for money. There are wars specifically to exploit third world nations, to create conflict for the sake of selling military weapons. And that is a known fact. That's what's happening right now in Yemen. Saudi Arabia has been attacking civilians there for the sake of fostering a commerce with North American firms creating the weapons to support this. Canada is wrapped up in that. Canada provided these tanks, basically, to Saudi Arabia. We're now crafting destruction for profit scenarios against humans, against people, on the premise that they're not worthy because they're not Christian. And that is the bottom line. We know the people who are involved with such scandals. Agencies like Blackwater have been accused in media reports that I've read of being racist in their approach, of being the new crusaders of the world who are willing to destroy non-Catholic communities for the sake of money. They're mercenaries, and they're being manipulated by very large corporations in the world that have an interest in making those kind of profits and taking advantage of perhaps redevelopment schemes or pesticide schemes or arms and weaponry sales. The same group shows up over and over again. When people are talking about the 1% in the Occupy movement, they really mean it. Because what you do, this is what I did, and this is how I learned the facts. I went to the NASDAQ website and I typed in names like SNC-Lavalin to find out who are the industry investors. And it gave me a company called Gulf International Bank UK. And when I clicked on that, it took me to an account where the members include things like Apple and Microsoft and a long list of very well-known companies. And then when I looked at other groups like Vanguard and I found out who the industry funders are behind them, I find the same list of companies. And then when I looked at other groups, BlackRock, it was the same thing. And it's like the same names keep popping over again and again and again and again and again. And consumers need to be aware of this because we're the ones making these people rich by buying their services. And if we knew more about what they were doing and about how many have offshore accounts, Exxon, for example, has $47 billion in offshore monies right now, and they may or may not be paying their fair share taxes as a result. You know, it's scary to name names. It's scary to risk lawsuits and defamation. I'm not one who has the knowledge or the ability to challenge these firms myself. All I have is the ability to talk about the articles that I've read that are already published. Please review who funds who, see the list for yourself, and write to your politicians about it. If you don't support what Canada is doing in supplying tanks to the Saudi Arabia to make $11 billion, tell our government. Because I don't think that targeting human life by way of attacking civilians is a reasonable business model for Canada to embrace. I don't think that trying to find out who's going to profit from the water crises is reasonable. You know, I'm scared that there's been a destruction for profit scenario with First Nations people going on for a long time. I'm scared that we've been targeted and that our human lives haven't been equally protected. I'm scared of the mentality of the people who allowed this to go on. And I want Justin Trudeau to step up and stop oil subsidies. And I want that money to go back to protecting human lives equally. Close that gap, Mr. Trudeau. Because every life counts. And we can't afford to delay climate change solutions. We need to stop the subsidies now, and we need to redirect those funds into renewable energy. And if we can bring a man to the moon, surely we can bring renewable energy to help First Nations communities access free electricity ongoing. You know, we can have greenhouses that are run on solar power, that use composting systems to help heat. There's so many ways that we can create solutions without having to rely on the companies that funded the problem. And I think at this point in time, oil companies have a lot of the firms that have those offshore accounts not even paying their taxes, not even supporting the rest of Canada, let alone First Nations people. I don't think that we should be throwing any money their way anymore. Their gloves are dirty, and their ethics are even worse. And it's time we said goodbye, kick these guys out of our politics, stop them from sharing the offices with our M&R minister. Why is there so many oil reps sitting on the NEB when we should have professors and environmental experts and actual engineering experts instead of patronizing oil company executives? I'm sick. I'm sick of what I see. The fact that it's gone so far. The reason Idle No More started was because the chief of Attawapiskat had the courage to demand a meeting with Harper, and it was denied. And I think that we've been pushed on the back burner far too long. And if the Prime Minister chooses not to act, we'll act for you. Because what you've done and what you're doing is illegal. It's against human rights. It's against constitutional rights. We need action. We need to protect human life with equity. And it's a lot to demand of Trudeau, considering the guy he's following, who made the situation much worse. Stephen Harper, in my view, should be in jail. What he's done and what he failed to do as a prime minister is deplorable. And I don't know. It's quite the mess. But I do want to see oil subsidies stopped. Thank you.